You're listening to the Candid Comms podcast with Rachel Miller. Tune in for practical advice and inspirational ideas to help you focus on all things internal communication related. Hello and welcome to the show. The language of change communication is what we're going to be talking about today. And as ever, you will leave with one thing to know, one thing to do, and one thing to think about. Let's get started. You may hear the following terms being used when talking about change communication. You may hear terms like change, transition, or even change management. Now, there's quite a lot of comms theory around, and something I want you to know, and I'm going to point you towards some resources to help you decipher the language around change. So one of my favourite, I've got many favourites when it comes to change comms theory and comms theory in general, but one of my favourites when it comes to change communication is Bridges and Mitchell. And their definitions are amongst my favourite to determine the difference between change and transition. They describe change as external and transition is internal. And the pace is crucial to note because they say transition happens much more slowly than change because it involves adjusting your thoughts. Let me give you an example, and it's the one that I always use when I'm trying to describe the difference between change and transition. And it's when I discovered at my 12-week pregnancy scan that I was expecting twins. The change happened instantly, straight away. I now had a multiple pregnancy rather than a singleton pregnancy, which is the language that's used when you're discussing single births or multiple births. So that change was instantaneous. However, the transition over the next 6 months before the babies were born saw my husband and I trying to imagine how life would be with newborn twins and their 2-year-old sister. So that psychological reorientation took all of those 6 months, took the remainder of my pregnancy, and took time to readjust, to reimagine, and to get organised. We thought we had all the baby equipment we possibly needed. In fact, we only had half the required amount. So transition takes time and it needs careful planning because you're dealing with emotions and you're often dealing with preparation. In this case, there was a natural deadline until our sons were born because we knew there were 6 months. But be mindful. Expect the deadline to be determined by the speed of transition. So I'll share a link in the show notes at allthingsic.com/podcast and check out the show notes for this episode. But Bridges, in his work, particularly on talking about managing transitions, says that there are 3 stages when you're looking at transitions in organisational change or change as a whole. There's saying goodbye, which is endings, a neutral zone, and then moving forward, which are your new beginnings. So I wonder, how often do you plan for change and transition through your organisational communication? Day one of a new intranet, if you've ever launched a new intranet or internal website, you know day one is not the completion of that campaign. Your content creators have to get used to the new way of working, discover how the templates that you've been carefully crafting and designing, perhaps with your IT team and your IC team and your intranet champions, you need to figure out if they're actually working and realise that the old way of working is no more. So transition is about that slow internalising what's happening with change. And I look for that, comms friends. I look for that when I'm analysing organisational change. I want to see what the speed is. If change can happen instantly and transition happens more slowly, how are we accounting for that? How are we allowing space and time for employees to get their heads around or catch up? How are we helping them get their head and their hearts aligned? Now, this is tricky. It's not easy. And it's even trickier when it's emotional, when it's sensitive, when it's something that impacts them directly, perhaps it's a restructure or redundancy or a merger or acquisition, the language around change is informed for me by the mindset. So it's really understanding where are our people at and how do we describe what's going on in the organisation. I've got some more definitions to share with you, and this comes from a new expert view in my latest book, Successful Change Communication, by my marvellous friend, Liam Fitzpatrick. If you don't know Liam and his work, I thoroughly encourage you to check him out. He is marvellous, and he has written various books on internal communication over the years, including Successful Employee Communications with Sue Dewhurst. And in my new book, we have defined 3 different ways of describing change. So we have said things change, people transition, and organisations and cultures transform. And that's how we've articulated the difference between the terminology. And there's lots of examples in the book of what we mean by that. And there's a model that you can see. So things change, people transition, and organisations and cultures transform. I wonder if that resonates for you. How are you using those terms inside your organisation? Does that help? Does that make things clearer? Do let me know. I'd love to know your feedback on that. Things change, people transition, and organisations and cultures transform. The other term I mentioned there is change management, and this is typically a way to control or manage transition. It's process-led, and it includes creating well-defined objectives that need to be achieved at the end of the process. Now, some organisations hire change management experts to support their ambitions, and I have featured lots of change communication professionals in my brand new book, including Dee Rosita. Now, Dee is a change management leader. She's an accredited senior change expert who specialises in change communications and behavioural change. And she wrote an expert view for me. Dee and I agree with the ethos of taking a compassionate and a bespoke approach to change, communication, and employee experience. And as someone who is brought into organisations to help them through change, I invited Dee to write an expert view, to share her observations from a change comms consultant's perspective. And I asked her to define the difference between change management and change communication. She said, "My view is that change comms is a critical component of change management, which can be simply described as managing change through effective stakeholder engagement, change communication, and training and support." I like how candid Dee has been in her expert view in my book, because she says sometimes you don't have the luxury to do them separately, or it depends on the extent to which change management is a business capability or part of how change is implemented in an organisation, or more simply, how mature the business is when it comes to change. She says often people come to change management from a different specialism, such as project management, business partnering, or communication. And Dee says she thinks it's because she started her career first in politics, where she developed strong stakeholder management and engagement skills, followed by corporate affairs and change communications. So it's difficult for her to separate the two, and she tends to bring all of those skill sets together instinctively in her work. So think about this for your organisation. How do you describe change? Do you talk about change? Do you talk about transition? Or do you talk about change management? And what impact does it have? If you are brand new into an organisation, or perhaps if you're working as a comms consultant, knowing how people describe change is really valuable to know. So what are the phrases that are in use inside an organisation? Or even better, what are the terms that must be avoided, or they are associated with a really painful change that happened inside the organisation? I'm fascinated by this. Understanding the language of change isn't just about what we're calling change, but it's how people are interpreting what they hear and what they feel when they hear these particular phrases. So if you have things like transformation or digital transformation. What does that mean? Does it mean, let's take digital, does it mean I got a new laptop? Or does it mean inside our organisation we changed all of our systems and processes and we invested in the latest technology and AI and all the things, all the bells and whistles, and actually it's a whole scale change. Everything has changed in terms of the way that we use technology. Often I find when I ask employees what certain changes meant for them or what it means for them currently, they'll make it really relevant. So they might be aware that there's a large scale digital transformation going on, but actually what it means for them is a new laptop. So the answer's not wrong. It's not wrong when employees answer. They're answering based on relevancy of how they fit into the bigger picture or what their experience is of change. The language that you use when you're describing change inside an organisation has the potential to have incredible power. It's a responsibility to choose the right phrases and the right words. In this season of Candid Comms, I've talked about change and how it is okay to say the word change, and I mean that. Whenever I'm looking at an organisation, I look at the language that's in use, and I also try to work out, what are you not saying? So what are you hiding behind? And I see this, comms friends, so much where people try to obscure what is actually happening and they try and dress it up and make it seem more exciting than it is, or more straightforward, actually. I was trying to think of the right word to say there. The more straightforward than it is. Change, by the nature of it, is complicated, it's messy, it can be emotional. It's rarely straightforward because we're dealing with people and their emotions, and that's okay. Hiding behind hyperbole and really overwhelming language and overly flowery and overly complicated doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the internal communicator, it doesn't help HR professionals, it doesn't help our CEOs, and it certainly does not help our employees. Be mindful of the language of change inside your organisation. Don't use phrases that are overly complicated, and they don't need to be. It might be accurate, and I've written about this in my book, it might be accurate to talk about sunsetting or grandfathering a policy, which both mean to retire, to move away from. That might be the HR way of describing it, and that might be well and good if you're in conversation with HR colleagues. However, if you're trying to communicate with employees and involve them in the change and help them feel like change is done with them, not to them and at them, but with them and for them, then using phrases like sunsetting and grandfathering is not going to be the one. But I digress. So this is what I want you to know. I want you to know, what are you using inside your organisation to describe organisational change? And what's the impact of using those words? If you find that you have multiple ways to describe organisational change, and it feels like you're trying to reinvent the wheel, and actually you've gone so far away from saying this is change that people don't realise that it's change, that's not working hard enough for you. If you're trying to talk about, we've had this in recent years actually, thinking about it, there are certain phrases inside organisations that now cannot be touched with a 10-foot pole, that they need to avoid because they've been used and overused, and they've lost their meaning. And how that matters. So think about your organisation. What I want you to know is, how do you describe change inside your organisation? Do you say transition? Do you say transformation? How do you describe it? And what's the impact of the choices that you're making? Do you describe all changes the same? Or do you categorise change in different ways? Are you certain what that is? If you are in a comms team, even if you're a team of one, if you're in a wider team particularly, that's even more important if there's more than one person in a comms team. What's the criteria? What makes something transformation, and what makes it a transition, and what makes it change, and what makes it business as usual? Do you know? Do you have criteria in place inside your organisation? If you don't, would that be helpful to consider? Let's turn to what we need to do. Now, I've shared with you that it is okay to use the word change in your internal communication and to create clarity through its meaning. Change requires a dedicated focus, and we need to be able to communicate what it does and doesn't mean. Don't assume that employees know what is meant by whatever terminology you're using inside your organisation. I encourage you to invest time clarifying the meaning and checking for understanding. As part of writing my book, I asked Jennifer Sproul, who's the Chief Executive of the Institute of Internal Communication, how she defines change. And she told me, change is the process of making or becoming something different. I'm endlessly fascinated by the divergence between how we typically approach change in our personal lives and how change is handled in the world of work. There is a world of contrast. Do you check for understanding inside your organisation? What that means, if that term is new to you, you're not sure what I mean by that, checking for understanding means I have communicated something, or I've shared an update on something inside an organisation. Say we're talking about organisational change and we're setting out a new way of working, for example, then checking for understanding is, there's loads of questions there for me. Lots of things that I ask. Does this make sense? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you understand it? Is it clear what the actions are that are required of you as an employee? The checking for understanding isn't just, do you know what's meant by the word change? I mean, that's a good start, but it's more than that. It's looking at, are our employees clear what the asks are of them? If we're asking them to spend money differently, or to change their habits, or change their behaviours, or adopt new policies or ways of working. Checking for understanding is not just that people know the phrases that are in use inside the organisation, but they're clear what the actions are that they're being encouraged to take, whether that's something they need to start doing, or stop doing, or continue doing. That's what I mean when I'm talking about checking for understanding. I want to know at all levels of an organisation, and thinking hierarchically here, is it clear from a leadership perspective what the change means for them? Do they understand how to talk confidently and knowledgeably about the change? What are the asks for them? And what about our frontline workers, or our office-based workers, or our shift workers, or our people working from home, or our people who are driving buses, or our people who are on a hospital ward? What does the change mean for them? How do they describe it? Sometimes I find that there's a disconnect and there's confusion inside an organisation where everyone is actually talking about the same change, but they describe it differently. That can be because of how local leaders have felt comfortable or not communicating the change. They might have tried to soften it, and they might try to dilute it slightly so it doesn't sound as scary, or it doesn't sound like we're talking about restructures. When we are working inside organisations and we are trying to hide and obscure the facts behind language, nobody wins in this scenario. So sometimes I find that inside an organisation where there'll be certain pockets of the organisation, certain regions or departments or countries or continents, where the organisational change is described in one way, perhaps being fit for the future, something like that. And then the same change is being described in a completely different way on the other side of the globe. Now, sometimes that's okay. From a cultural perspective, it might be that the phrases that are in place don't translate into local language. So people have come up with what feels right for their organisational culture at a localised level. You need to know that, comms friends. You need to know, how do people describe the change? It's not even about geographical boundaries. Sometimes I've found the difference between how people describe or understand or comprehend an organisational change depends on the floor that they're sitting in inside a building. It's not about needing a passport to cross over boundaries. It's actually that because of the localised conversations and the leadership style and the management style around them, how change is talked about is very localised, and it's done in a way that feels right for that team, that department, that region, that country. I wonder whether you know that for your organisation. When you're analysing change communication, and this is helpful at any stage of a change, checking for understanding and testing recall at the start. Top tip from me, comms friends, something I really want you to do is do not wait until the very end to measure this. And the reason being, it is super helpful to find out 3 weeks into using a phrase like digital transformation that your employees don't really know what we're talking about, rather than 6 months down the line or 12 months down the line. If you wait 6 months to find out that the phrase you were using to describe the change doesn't make sense, it's too late. You've lost people. And I've seen that where employees have said to me in focus group or listening scenarios where I'm testing for recall and I'm checking for understanding. Testing for recall is, what can people tell you about the change? So are they recalling the key messages, the key facts? Do they know timeline? It's things like that. But when I'm listening to employees, I've often heard this where people have shared back to me what their understanding is of the change. And it matters that we know this, because in those sorts of scenarios, when I've listened to clients' employees and they've told me how they feel about things, I often hear comments like, I don't know what that means. I kept waiting for them to explain it, but they didn't. So I figured it mustn't be important, can't be important. Oh my goodness. What a waste of energy. What a waste of effort. What a frustrating situation to be in, because these poor employees feel like, don't really know what that is. It's overly complicated. It's flowery language. I don't really get it. And they're waiting for it to be described. And again, this is where the relevancy bit comes in. They're waiting to understand what this means for me, for my team, my department, my region. If you've read my first book, you know that is relevancy. I talk about that a lot in internal communication strategy. And in every masterclass I think I've taught since 2016, I have talked about relevancy and how important it is, particularly when it comes to change communication. So how do we help employees understand how things are relevant for them? Be it a change or an organisational strategy, whatever it might be. So that's what I want you to do, comms friends. Really think about, what does the language of change mean for our people? Is it clear what the asks are of them? We're checking for understanding and maybe testing recall as well, which is, as I said, the key messages, or what do you know about this initiative? What do you know about this project, for example? We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I will leave you with one thing to think about. See you in a moment.
Candid Comms is brought to you by All Things IC. We specialise in training, consultancy and one-to-one support. Rachel has also written 2 books, Internal Communication Strategy and Successful Change Communication. To buy a signed copy or find out more information, visit our website, allthingsic.com. That's ALLTHINGS, Thank you for listening.
Welcome back. In the final part of today's episode, I'm going to share something for you to think about when we're considering the language of change. I asked my 13-year-old daughter to share her experiences of change with me as an expert view for my book, and she told me verbatim, I can deal with change if I know about it ages in advance. I will hate it, but I can deal with it. I need as long as possible to help me prepare, and it's probably longer than you would think, but it helps me understand the change and get my mind ready. Now, my daughter has autism and ADHD. We have a very neurospicy household. Many of us in my household, out of the 5 of us, are neurodivergent. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when you are trying to communicate change and you're trying to check for understanding and test for recall and all the things we talked about before the break, I encourage you, when you are looking demographically at your organisation and perhaps you're testing for understanding and checking whether people make sense of what you're trying to describe inside the organisation, and you're doing it by age perhaps, or geography, or type of role, or length of service, consider neurodivergence as well. Something that I have learned, particularly since 2022, when my household and I have been exploring and understanding and educating ourselves far more about neurodivergence and what it is and how it works, and the reasonable adjustments that we need to make on a day-to-day basis in order to aid communication amongst ourselves, with each other, and particularly for my children at school, has required me to learn as much as I possibly can. So in the book, in Successful Change Communication, my daughter has shared examples of what she's done to help herself respond and manage and plan for change. So we talked about and wrote about moving from primary school to high school, which is a huge change for any child. The move happened before she was diagnosed with autism and ADHD, and looking back, I wouldn't modify anything about the way that we communicated, even without knowing her needs at the time. My husband and I instinctively over-communicated, but it didn't feel like that for her. So ahead of the academic year starting, she put on her brand new uniform and we washed it to make it feel softer because of her sensory needs, although we didn't have that label at the time. We used photographs and videos. We had maps. We did recce's of the bus journey. We stood at the bus stop to familiarise her. I downloaded copies of the school menu. I showed her images of the food there, so she wasn't overwhelmed trying to decipher what it was in the moment. And she's quoted as saying, "The way I coped with so much change was to colour code everything, including my school stationery and my notebooks. Everything felt out of control as it was all new. So I wanted to feel prepared and in control of something. Having set patterns and logical choices for my belongings helped me. Even with so much preparation, bless her, she still failed to turn up to her first maths lesson on day one as she got overwhelmed by all the directions on the maps." And I'm really grateful to her for allowing me to share that insight into the way that her mind works, because when we are planning organisational change and we're trying to look at the language of organisational change, consider how we bring our neurodivergent colleagues with us. Invite them to give you feedback. Invite them to be part of your planning process. If you have change champions or editorial champions or comms champions inside your organisation, make sure that you are including your neurodivergent colleagues. It's either 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 people are neurodivergent. So there's more of us than you may imagine. And when you are trying to plan organisational change, it's not just making things clear and concise and immediately understandable. It's not just beneficial for our neurodivergent colleagues, it's beneficial for everybody. There is an episode in this season about my change communication cloverleaf. If you've not listened to that yet, I encourage you to check it out. When I've been looking at making sure that language is clear inside organisations, that there is clarity, so jargon-free language, clear explanations, and things are immediately understandable, particularly since 2022, I've been bearing my children in mind. Would this make sense for them? Do they need additional explanations? Would it be better to have written communication and visual communication? Yes, is more often than not the answer there. And I realise from all the learning that I've done, and I am still learning, how best to support and communicate with my family and with clients and comms friends who are neurodivergent. If there is a way to give more context, to not assume that at first reference people understand stuff, the better. So checking for understanding, testing for recall, checking for clarity. Make sure you are involving and listening to your neurodivergent colleagues. Your future self will thank you, and they definitely will too. So make sure, don't assume that everybody can immediately understand and take things on board in the same way. I hope you found this episode useful. We've covered a lot today. Do check out the show notes at allthingsic.com koganpage.com/podcast. And if you would like to get hold of a copy of either of my books, if you've not already, do use the code Candid Comms via the Kogan Page website. That's KOGANPAGE. That's the publisher, koganpage.com. If you use Candid Comms, it will remove 25% at the checkout. And top tip, when you're ordering, select bundle, and that means that they'll send you the electronic version of the book while you wait for your physical copy to wing its way over to you. You can also find it via your favourite bookstore, online or in person. And if you would like a signed copy of either book, please check out the Rachel's Books page at allthingsic.com, where I can send the limited edition of the book to you, and I can personalise a note at the front, whether it's for you, for a colleague or a member of your team, whoever you would like to send a book to, and you would like a note in the front, do let me know at the checkout. So check out allthingsic.com and you can find out information of how to order a signed limited edition of either book. As ever, I love hearing from you. Do let me know what you're taking away from this episode. What made you think? What are you going to do differently as a result of listening to this episode of Candid Comms? You can find me online. I'm Rachel Miller over on LinkedIn. The website is allthingsic.com, or why not send the team and I a message at hello@allthingsic.com. And remember, what happens inside is reflected outside. See you again soon.